Okay, welcome back, guys. Today we are going to be finishing up week three here, so week three, part two. I'm going to start by giving you a little bit more logistics for the class. So we are in week three, which means that chapters seven and eight reading quizzes, which are already up on Canvas, are due Sunday at midnight. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about the first article response, which is due July 25th, what I've emphasized before. It's probably good for you and for me if you get it in prior to the midterm, just so once you're finished with the midterm, you don't have to worry about it. And I think if you get started on it now, it'll be just a good idea for you. So, what are these article responses? Well, what you're going to do is you're going to find an article. It's going to publish since the start of the class, which this can be kind of loose, just something recent. There's a lot of things going on in the news, so I'm sure it won't be hard to find something, but maybe like stuff past June 1st is a good indication of something that's kind of recent. I'm not going to be super strict about that, but definitely not something from 2024, preferably not something from like January 2025 either. Okay. So the article that you pick is going to be talking about some sort of macroeconomic issue that's related to this class. I do not want you to pick an opinion piece, uh, which is like an op-ed, but pick something that is about a current event, and the article should just kind of describe what's happening with this current event. So, like an example from a couple years ago when I taught Econ 200. We had a similar article response. They were talking about how a bunch of chickens got sick, so then we had a chicken eggs shortage. So the article that a lot of people picked was about this, where it just described the shortage, described what was happening to the price of eggs, but it didn't really get into much more analysis. So you don't want to get into whole bunch of things talking about how inflation causes this and all of this stuff. I just want you to, find an article that's like, oh, here's this policy, and this is kind of like what we found, but not really getting into the nitty-gritty of like, okay, so the supply for X changed, which caused the demand for that to change, blah, 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 because that's your job. That's what you're going to do with this. So the first chunk of this is you're going to give me like a half-page summary, pretty much describing what the article is saying, what's going on in this event. This can be only a half page, double spaced. All of this, I guess I should emphasize, this can all be double spaced. You don't really have to get too far into it. Just kind of fill me in so I know what's going on with this article. The second half of this, which is more important, is your analysis. So that's down here. This is like the analysis section. This is the most important part. So you're gonna write about a half page summarizing in econ language, what's going on, what maybe do you expect to happen with certain indicators? Do you expect this to cause GDP to increase? Do you expect the United States to go into a recession because of this? Do you expect inflation to increase? And then using your summary and along with this analysis, uh, draw a graph of something that we have used in class. This can be like as easy as supply and demand. It can be supply and demand for any type of market you want to talk about. And mainly you're going to I would suggest drawing this graph first and then use that half page of analysis to just explain what's going on with this graph, explain any shifts that you indicate, all of the above. Okay. I'll also emphasize with this graph that I'm not expecting anything with like hard data. So even though you may read an article and it's talking about the price has risen or inflation has risen to a X amount of number. I just care about, in general, what happens. So, for example, if we take our egg shortage, you what I would look for is you have supply and demand, and then maybe give me like call this Q0 and price zero. And then because a bunch of chickens got sick, we had a supply shock that was negative. So then supply goes upward, and then I would expect you to label this like P1 and P0, and in your analysis, and also draw like these arrows. These really help so I know which way something is shifting. But say like, okay, so the price should increase and the quantity should go down, something like that. And in your analysis, you're going to explain that, but I'm not expecting you to come up with specific calculations of how much the price should go up and how much the quantity should go down. Okay. So that's a little bit about the article response, what I'm expecting. There's a couple examples that are already on Canvas. I gave you guys a template to make this easier for you guys. And like I said, I really care a lot about the analysis. For the summary, don't spend a whole lot of time on it. Just quickly explain what's happening with this article. Okay, so all in all together, I guess the process I would take is I would look at, the New York Times, maybe the Wall Street Journal, BBC, something like that. And I would just find an article in their like economics or business section that's somewhat macroeconomic related. And as I'm going through the article, I would like to first think, okay, what is the graph that I'm going to draw? And from there, I would just draw the graph, draw the shifts, start with the analysis, make sure the analysis is good, and only a half page is what I'm expecting. And then throw the link for the article in there along with your half page summary of the event. So it's hard for me to say how long this is going to take. I have a little more experience with economics compared to you guys, but to give you a rough estimate, I think this entire process should take 1 to 2 hours, maybe more to the 2 hour mark. So it shouldn't take a whole lot of time for you guys. It's a good skill to learn. It's why we keep assigning these types of assignments is from this class and from Econ 200, we really want you to say, okay, I've learned all these economic models. Now I can apply them to the real world. So when you go home for Thanksgiving or when you're talking to your parents or something like that, you can kind of give a little indication that's more than just what you read online. So you can learn it through this class in some way. Okay, so that's the article response. Remember your reading quizzes. There's two of them. They are due on Sunday at midnight. Your midterm is approaching, I think in 2 weeks. So by the time you are watching this, your midterm will be it'll be in 2 weeks from today if you're watching it on Wednesday. So maybe start studying for that. I will probably post materials as in old exams for that probably this upcoming weekend. And I will also urge you guys to look at like the examples that I do at the end of class. Those are good examples of possible exam questions. Okay, so today we are going to be talking about inflation mostly, which is kind of going to kind of build on a lot of things that we've been talking about. So we're still going to be using GDP, all of these previous definitions that we've talked about. We'll look at a bunch of pretty pictures and then we'll do a little bit of calculations. So we're going to start with the miracle in Venezuela question mark. So a few decades ago, the South American nation, Venezuela, had one of the world's fastest growing nominal GDPs. Nominal GDP, remember, that means it's not fixed for inflation. Whereas real GDP is fixed for inflation. So between 1997 2007, Venezuelan nominal GDP grew by an average of 28% each year, which is massive. So it's much faster than nominal GDP in the United States or even China. So the question, you could read this in some sort of article where it says, wow, the nominal GDP is growing by 28% each year, that's amazing. That means they're a quarter of their GDP is just expanded every single year. So questions you may ask is like, are they experiencing some sort of economic miracle? If you're a good economist, you're going to say, why are you looking at nominal GDP? Why are you hiding real GDP from me? Um, so if you look here at the graph, here's the nominal GDP. As you can see, it has exploded. But then you look at the real GDP, and real GDP is it tells a different story. It's very flat, right? So what's actually happening is from in this time period, they had unusually high inflation. So, just a background on inflation. Inflation could be, look, here's my phone. Today it's worth $20. Then I go to Apple tomorrow and it's worth $40. That means I would be experiencing 100% inflation because the price has doubled, right? So when you have rapid inflation, the value in your currency of the goods you produce is just going to increase just in general, right? So if I sell one iPhone today for $20, and then tomorrow I sell one iPhone for $40, then your nominal GDP would double. But obviously, if we're looking at the real GDP, you're not really doing much different because the dollar that you're working with just lost value, right? So and that's what kind of happened in Venezuela. So even though the nominal GDP increased by 28% per year, you look at the real GDP and it's essentially flat. Okay, so what is inflation? Inflation is increase in the price of goods and services in the economy. The same amount of money gets you a lesser amount of goods compared to before. So in Venezuela, their currency lost value really fast, which means that to buy if I am selling you an iPhone instead of wanting $20, now I want $40 because the currency that you're using is not as valuable to me as it was yesterday. What causes inflation is always a great question to ask. So there's a couple big things that are very broad. We'll get into more detail later, but the main things are money supply growth. So that's an increase in what we call the velocity of money. So velocity of money is how frequently money changes hands. So if you have velocity of money that's very high, it means it changes hands very quickly. And this is by far the most frequent cause of inflation, referred to as a demand pull inflation. The other cause of inflation is just price shocks to important commodities. So fossil fuels that ripple through the entire economy, and it references OPEC in the early 1970s, is referred to as cost push inflation. So there's two big things. There's demand pull inflation. And then there's also cost push inflation. So let's talk about OPEC for a bit. In the 1970s, or right before the 1970s, gas was really cheap in America. What this meant is like people got, cars. They didn't really care about their fuel economy. It was great. People would even get this. If you're young, this may surprise you, but people would just say, "I'm gonna go on a drive," and that was like something you would do on the weekends or after work is you would just go up and down on pretty roads because you didn't really care about using gas because gas was so cheap. Then OPEC, which is they control a lot of the supply of oil, they ran into a conflict with the United States, which caused them to control more oil and give it less to the United States, which made the price of oil really expensive. So when the price of oil became really expensive, this changed behaviors. So cars became more fuel efficient because now people want to demand those cars more than they did before. And it also led to inflation because people still needed gas, and now gas is more expensive. So why does high inflation often correspond to a bad signal for the economy is something that we'll talk about. And then there's other, here are just other common terms that you've probably heard related to inflation. So deflation is when the prices decrease. This doesn't really happen at all. I think Japan was the closest to having deflation because of the saving patterns of their citizens. Stagflation is something you really don't want to be in because stagflation means you have rising unemployment, inflation, and declining GDP. So it was thought through old economic models to be impossible for the before the 1970s, and then we actually found out it is possible um, in when we had that oil crisis. So stagflation, again, the key things: rising unemployment, that's not good. Declining GDP, that's terrible for an economy. And on top of that, you have inflation, which inflation is generally not great for an economy. However, we'll talk about a healthy amount of inflation, and a healthy amount of inflation is about 3%. Deflation is also bad. So if you're in an economy with deflation, which means this percent would be like -1%, that's not a great place to be in. And then there's one more extreme called hyperinflation, and it's an inflation rate that's about 50% or more per month. In Venezuela, they experienced hyperinflation. I'm pretty sure Argentina recently experienced hyperinflation, but I could be wrong about that. I know they did have a problem with inflation. So let's look at a couple examples. Germany in 1923, at the peak of German hyperinflation, the exchange rate between the dollar and the mark was 1 trillion marks to $1. And a wheelbarrow full of money would not even buy a newspaper. So here's like a crazy picture. This guy is taking all of his money that he's earned for I don't know how long it took him to obtain all that money, and he could exchange that for like literally one newspaper, right? Because their currency became not valuable at all. So usually when we talk about inflation, we tie it to the dollar is typically how we do it. But we typically tie it to the history of your currency. So how much was it worth yesterday compared to how much is it worth today? 1945, 1946 in Hungary, so this is after World War II, they had the highest monthly inflation rate, which hit 41.9 quadrillion percent. So just to put this into perspective, say you go to work and you get $20, right? So and you could spend it today, which means that you would be you maybe you could buy a side of fries, a burger, a drink, and maybe another burger for $20, right? And you're like, okay, that's good, good day of work. And then you go to work the next day and you get $20 again. But now you have this inflation that's way out of hand. So you go back to the same diner, and now the diner is saying, yeah, you can have a one ketchup packet for $20. So that's kind of like insane inflation. This is very, very insane. Hyperinflation is not great. And then here's a couple other cases in the figure down below of hyperinflation. If you want to read through those, they're pretty interesting. Um, yes, very nice. Okay, let's talk about Zimbabwe for a bit. So I think Zimbabwe was actually in the last lecture when we talked about GDP, and I kind of hinted at they had negative growth, and I was like, oh, well, that was due to inflation, but we didn't really talk a whole lot about it. So let's talk more about Zimbabwe. So this bill, pictured above, it was worth 100 billion Zimbabwe dollars when it was issued in 2008. There was even bills issued with a face of 100 trillion Zimbabwe dollars, which had 100 trillion written on them. It's a lot of zeros. But they were pretty much worthless because Zimbabwe currency equating to the US dollar is was ridiculous. So it says at one point 622 million Zimbabwean dollars were equal to one US dollar. So you could have this dollar that says it's 100 trillion with all those zeros, but can't even like buy you a candy bar in the United States. Okay, so eventually the country abandoned its own currency and allowed people to use foreign currency for purchases. This, I will say, is a pretty common technique if your inflation is just so out of hand with your national currency. This is one reason why like the euro became in place in the EU. China also tied their currency strictly to the dollar, meaning it purposely made it so it was like 2 yen was $1. I'm not sure the exact exchange rate. I'm not even sure if it's still in place to this day. I think they actually may have moved away from that, but I'm not sure. So, what like caused this to happen in Zimbabwe, right? So money creation, much of which was used for financing the wars, they were in some wars, and increased salaries of government officials and soldiers kind of inherently made it worthless. Okay, so this is like a good point to realize, like the US dollar, for example, it's printed. It's a piece of paper and the people believe it is worth a certain amount to trade with, right? If I have 900 US dollars, I can exchange it for one iPhone, right? But if the government just decided to print a whole bunch of US dollars and hand them out to a ton of government officials, hand them out to all these people fighting in like a war, then it's going to make the US dollar weaker because, well, the US dollar is more abundant, right? So a big thing about like how dollars work, why they work, is because people just believe they have that value. It used to be we were on like what was called the gold standard, which means if we printed a dollar, this means we had gold. And gold has like an inherent value because you can use it to make all this jewelry. But we abandoned that, and I believe we abandoned that during the Great Depression, and we just believed that people were still going to have this value over the US dollar, which in hindsight has worked pretty well for us. People do believe the US dollar has value, which is a good thing. Okay, so when does inflation matter? Well, if prices and wages aren't sticky, inflation doesn't matter. Empirically, this is not true at all. So if prices and wages aren't sticky, wages typically are very sticky, right? So if I will go back to that example where I took home $20 and then the next day I went to work and there was hyperinflation, the my boss is not just going to be like, okay, instead of giving you $20 today, I'm going to give you $1 million because that's will still buy you two burgers, fries, and a soda. No, they're gonna say I'm still gonna give you $20, right? So because wages in particular, but also it can go with prices, they are sticky. Inflation does matter because it makes it so you can't buy as much as what you could before. So if the price of everything, again, including wages, is the big one, doubles, nothing really changes. Instead of you make $20 one day, you go back the next day to work and you make $40 and you get to buy the same amount of food, which makes you equally happy. That's just not really how the world works, though. So if prices and wages can't adjust instantly, uh, things change. So here you go. Here's an example. If the price of food doubles, but wages take a year to change, people will not be able to afford to eat as much as before. Okay, so kind of like how do we measure inflation? We use price indexes. So a couple of definitions here is a market basket. It's a bundle of goods and services which are used to measure changes in the overall price level. This is done by the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. It uses a huge variety of goods and services to get an accurate measure of price changes across the economy. So examples of items included, food is a big one, energy is a big one. This is typically there's like own indexes about the price of oil and how that impacts inflation. Apparel is also in there down to like particular items like underwear and even funerals. Okay. And then how do we measure how prices have changes? Well, we take a basket. So imagine you go to the grocery store and you buy the same items in two separate years. You go in 2024 and then you go back right now in 2025. And then you give your receipt or you swipe the card and it says, okay, it was $100 yesterday. Now buying the same exact thing is $110. So $110 would be the cost of the market basket right now in the given year. And then the cost of the basket in the base year would be the $100 that you spent last year. So the ratio of the current cost of that market basket to the cost in the base year multiplied by 100 is what gives us the price index, which is known as the CPI. There are a lot of CPIs, as you can imagine, because there's no like set rule of what should be in your grocery cart, what should be in the market basket. But largely they all move together. Okay, so here is a couple commonly used ones. There's the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, which is the price of the weighted average market basket of consumer goods and services, which is mainly purchased by households. You have the PPI. The only difference is these are produced or purchased by producers. So these can be input goods for making an iPhone. This can be the price of electricity, all of this. These are like the common ones. And within these two, there's like a slew of measures that people use with different baskets. Okay. The GDP deflator measures the price level by calculating the ratio of the nominal GDP to the real GDP, and we multiply that by 100. So if the nominal GDP is, say, 120 and the real GDP is 100, then you multiply that by 100 and you get a GDP deflator of 120. Okay? Very nice. All right. Very good. So, not just stepping outside the United States or a specific country, there's also international price index, which measures the inflation based on the prices of merchandise that are specifically exported or imported into your country. And then the employment cost index is a measure of inflation on the wage paid in the labor market. Okay, so if wages move the same along with prices, the employment cost index should give you the same as like the CPI. Typically, wages to be slack and a little more sticky. So the employment cost index is a little behind the CPI at most times. Here are the core inflation indexes. So I'll let you read them, what's going on. Very nice. Let's move on. Okay. So let's look at what's the difference between the CPI, remember, and the GDP deflator. So the CPI, this is talking about the consumer price index, right? So we're talking about how people are going to go and buy stuff for their household. How do those prices change? And then GDP deflator, like in the name, is specifically tied to GDP, which is the purchase of the final goods, right? So first is that GDP deflator includes only domestic goods, not anything that is imported. So this is just talking about, if we're talking about the United States, just talking about things made in the United States. Whereas the CPI takes into effect the imports from different countries, okay? So it's different because the CPI includes anything bought by consumers, which a lot of the times, as we are a very consumer-heavy nation that imports a ton of goods, this includes foreign goods. Okay. The second difference is the GDP deflator is a measure of the price of all goods and services. CPI, it's only goods bought by consumers. Okay. So both of these measures kind of go hand in hand. They're both good to know, good to look at when we're talking about how well a nation is doing with their inflation. Okay, here's a very pretty circle of what goes into the CPI. So housing is a large chunk. Food and beverages, also a large chunk. The cost of transportation, so this can be the cost of buying cars, the cost to use the light rail, I guess, would be in this group. Medical care is also a large chunk, and then education, recreation, other goods, and apparel make up a little bit less of the CPI. All right, very nice. So here is the CPI trend over um, a lot of years since the 1920s, I guess. Again, with these Fred's graphs, always good to know. These highlighted areas mean we are in a recession. Okay, so you see generally that the CPI tends to fall when you're in a recession, which is this is a pretty common thing that's happening, which gives us some intuition that like when we're in a recession, this means that inflation decreases, right? So because I'm in a recession, people don't want to spend as much money. This causes inflation to decrease. Now you do see in the 1970s, here it is right here, where inflation increased and we were in a recession. That's stagflation. So this is stagflation. We also kind of had a little bit of that during COVID, except COVID was a bit of an anomaly for that. All right. But generally over time, prices tend to go up. That's just how how the world works. There's nothing wrong with that. Um, so yeah. Okay. Here's the producer price index. So kind of a similar picture to what we just saw, but now we're looking at producers. Here you can find the oil crash, which is right there. That's the stagflation period. Here is the Great Recession, where we saw the producer price index take a big hit. Um, so yeah, and some nice graphs right here for you guys to look at. How do we calculate inflation? That's kind of we use CPI. So CPI is what we already talked about. It went up, it went down. Okay, but what happens with inflation? So the rate of inflation is just given by the CPI today minus the CPI yesterday over the CPI yesterday, which we can kind of translate to something I talk about a lot, which is new minus old over old. It's just the percentage change of the CPI. This tells us how fast prices are increasing or possibly decreasing, but that would be deflation, and that does not really happen. Okay, so here's like an example of something that you could be asked to calculate is like what's the inflation in this table? So here we have pre and post inflation, and we have the price of oranges, the price of grapefruit, and the prices of lemons. Okay, so what we're gonna do is our market basket that we're using is 200 oranges, 50 grapefruits, 100 lemons. So first, we're gonna look at our grocery basket pre-inflation, which is buying 200 oranges for 20 cents, 50 grapefruit for 60 cents, and 100 lemons for 25 cents. And this at the register comes up for $95. Now we're going to look at what happens post-inflation. And now this same basket, buying the same amount of goods, costs $175. So we let the pre-inflation cost be what we call like the base year. And then your index pre-inflation. This is kind of a weird one, but it measures like how the prices change right now. This should always be 100 though. This should always be 100, okay? Index post-inflation is going to take the post-inflation cost divided by the old inflation, multiply that by 100, okay? So we're finding two CPIs. This is CPI today. This is CPI yesterday. Okay, and then to find inflation, we're gonna use our new minus old over old. So new is gonna be 184.2 minus 100 over our old, which is 100. We multiply that by 100. Um, this gives us 84% roughly. Okay. In this equation down here, they didn't multiply it by 100, so they just had 0.84. You multiply that by 100 to get the percent that we want, the 84%. Okay. Um, so here is a bigger table. I believe this is real data from the United States as well. And it looks at the CPI, so we're given CPI numbers, and then we can find this change in the CPI. So from our new minus old is 4.9. When you divide that by the old, which is 172.2, you get 0.028, which is your inflation rate. Remember, this is your inflation rate is not 0.028%. It's you multiply that by 100, so it'd be 2.8%. Okay. So maybe, if you're looking at this graph, it might be a good idea to do a couple of these. Maybe, the fun ones are going to be 2008 to 2009, 2007 to 2008. And then you can double check your work by making sure these numbers are correct and along with your inflation rate is correct. So these are kind of just throwing in some example problems. If you have some time and you want to practice inflation rate, this is the kind of table you want to look at. Okay. Or you can just look at this example, which I've prepped for you, which is a very nice one because it gives you very clean numbers, hopefully. So here we have the price of a certain good in 2016, and then the price of that good in 2017. So good one goes from $1 to $1.50. Good two goes from $2 to $4. Okay. And then we also have differences in the quantity produced or the quantity consumed in each year. Okay. So from this, we can calculate the GDP. You already know how to do this. You take 1 times 100 plus 2 times 100, and that will get you 300. We can do the same to get 525 for 2017. So this tells us that when we do 525 minus 300 over 300 times 100, this gives us 75, which is the nominal growth rate. Okay. We already talked about how we find real GDP. So to find real GDP, we pick a base year. In this case, it's going to be 2016. And then we take the quantity that we bought in 2017 using the prices of 2016. So that's what's done there. And then you get, okay, now our real GDP is 290. So it is less than the real GDP in 2016 because your base for your base year, the nominal GDP is going to be equal to the real GDP. So will always be the case. So it's 300 to 290. Again, we're using this equation where we do new minus old over old, and then we multiply it by 100, and that's how you get the negative 3.3%. Okay. Alternatively, what we could do is we could find the real GDP in 2016, but this time we're going to be using 2017 prices. So we're kind of just doing the opposite. We'll take the quantity here, multiply it by the price in 2017. You get 550, and then you can find the growth rate, still negative, but now a little more negative at negative 4.5%. Okay, so this is something we've already done when we talked about GDP. Let's see how it kind of relates to our CPI here. So the CPI for 2016 is going to be, we're going to take our market basket is going to be the 2016 quantities. Okay, so we'll take, to find the CPI in 2016, we're going to take, let's see, there it is. Take $1 times 100 of that quantity plus $2 times 100 of the quantity good two. And then we're going to divide that by your base year market basket, multiply that by 100, and you just get 100. So this is a good sanity check when you're looking at a CPI and you're using that base year. So the CPI for the base year should always equal 100. Okay. For 2017, what we're going to do now is we're going to take the quantity that we purchased in 2016, but now we're going to be using the prices in 2017. Okay. We can multiply that by 100 and you get 183.333. Okay. So again, how do we find inflation from this? Inflation is going to equal new minus the old over the old, and then you multiply that by 100 and you get it's 83%, which is what we found right there. Very nice. Okay, so inflation and deflation. The real wage is the wage rate divided by the price level. So how much stuff your wage actually buys. If your wage increases by 10%, but inflation is 15, you can buy less than before, so your real wage decreased. This goes along with real income, which is income divided by the price level. So how much real stuff your income represents. So this is like a large part of why people sometimes will get wages and there'll be wage increases and they'll be tied specifically to inflation levels. So, for example, if you walked into your job and you got a 4% wage increase, you shouldn't go crazy now that and be like, wow, they valued me so much. Well, actually, they just kept your real wage the same because inflation was 4%. So you actually are not better off, you're the same off. But it's good that they did this because if you did not get a wage increase, you'd inherently be making less money. Okay. Unions usually have contracts over a couple years with, like, for example, there's a union for the grad school employees, such as me, and they bargain for wage increases, which are tied to inflation in the future to make sure our real wage doesn't decrease. Because when your real wage decreases, that makes it harder to pay for rent because the price of rent is going to go up, etc. Okay. So here we are looking at real wages. So the red line is the weekly nominal earnings. So this is everyone getting, wow, we are getting so much richer. Minimum wage has increased. This is great because now we're getting paid, instead of $10, we're getting paid $15. So now I can afford to live in a house. But then you look at your house payment and it's increased by the same number. So if you look at the real wage across this time period, this is from 1980 all the way up to probably around 2020. It's pretty flat. Okay. It's not a bad thing. What you really would not want to see is for this to decrease. When this decreases, that means that these people are getting way worse off. Okay. So specifically when we're tied here, I guess is a good thing to note. This is talking about the median income, right? So we are not talking about the 1%, the people who make $1 zillion a year, and we're not talking about the people who make minimum wage. So people who make minimum wage, their real wage actually has decreased. We haven't increased the federal minimum wage since like a long time, like 70s or 80s, and it's still really small, which means your real wage for the minimum wage would be decreasing over time, right? So while the medium wage has remained pretty constant, which is a good sign, specifically the minimum wage has decreased in terms of the real wage. Okay, so along with inflation, we have what's called the nominal interest rate and then what is called the real interest rate. So the nominal interest rate is the interest rate expressed in terms of dollars, while the real is the nominal interest rate minus the rate of inflation. So if I borrow from you and offer to pay 10%, but in the meantime, there's 20% inflation. What happens is you've lost money because you give me $10 and I say, okay, I will pay you back $11 in a year. But actually, there's 20% inflation. So I pay you back $11, but if you just kept your $10 and maybe put it into a savings account, you would have $12 by now. So you lost $1 in that case. So really what we care about is the real interest rate. That's the big one here. Okay. Very nice. So let's talk a little more, getting into the nitty-gritty a little bit. There's things called the shoe leather cost, which are the increased costs of transactions, which are caused by inflation. So searching longer for goods since you're not sure if a price is a good one. This is delaying purchases. And then there's another thing called menu costs. So it's the real cost of changing a listed price, printing new menus, taking time and energy to decide on a new price. So for example, if you go into a grocery store, maybe less common today, but maybe you went to a grocery store like 10 years ago, and then you walk down the aisle and everyone's got the prices on all the goods. Okay. If they want to change the prices, they have to hire an employee who's got to walk down all the aisles for maybe 2 hours, and they have to decide what are they going to change the price to for every single good. Okay. Now, what you've seen in some stores, I'm sure they're doing it in Seattle, specifically if you have the electronic like prices. In New York, this has been like a problem is they will change the prices like instantaneously, maybe not due to inflation, but also due to like the time of the day. So in New York, you could walk into a grocery store and bread is $4 when you go at 10 a.m. And then you come back at 5 p.m. and now bread is $6. And there's less of a menu cost, meaning it doesn't really cost anything to change these prices. They're done automatically, so it's very cheap and easy. So they're gonna do that. Okay. Shoe leather cost is more if you have specifically like delaying purchases and searching longer for goods, because you don't really know if the price is a good one. So an example of this could maybe be on Amazon when you're trying to buy a certain thing and then they give you a zillion results and you don't know what's good quality for what certain price. So it takes you, there's more of a cost of a transaction because you have to scroll through Amazon and look through the reviews and make sure you're buying the right thing. Okay, unit of account costs arise from the way inflation makes money a less reliable unit of measurement. So when the price level changes randomly, it's difficult to know what the true value of the currency is. And this is going to create confusion in terms of how to set prices, what goods or services are worth. So it's hard to make decisions and long-term plans. So this is why we typically want inflation to be not, if we're looking at an inflation graph, we want inflation to be pretty constant. We don't want it to jump around. Oh, I just created a straight line. That would be okay if it was like that. We don't want it to jump up and down because this is going to create a bunch of uncertainty. Because when inflation's really low, I'll charge a certain price, but then tomorrow inflation's really high, so I should charge a different price. Another example, what causes inflation is reallocations of wealth. So some win, some lose from inflation. So this is just a transfer of wealth. Okay. So let's get into unit of account costs. So prices are the messengers in a market economy conveying information about conditions of the supply and the demand. So inflation kind of blurs those price messages. So when the levels and changes of price become quite uncertain, businesses and individuals are going to find it harder to react to economic signals. So I'm not sure if I talked about this, but a very hard thing to do empirically is kind of measure the demand, right? So measure the demand for like this pen. Um, what they could do if there's no inflation is they could test this by selling this pen for $5 one day, for $1 next day, for $2, and then for like $20, right? Um, and then they would have a good idea of what the demand curve looks like. With inflation, it's harder to do this. So we don't know, are prices increasing because people really want this item, or is it just because of inflation? Those two conflicting, uh, I guess, dynamics kind of make it a little bit messy sometimes. Okay, so another thing is long-term planning. Inflation can make long-term planning difficult. So if I plan for retirement, I'm not really sure what the future dollar level is like. So there's more time spent by businesses finding ways of profiting from inflation versus less time spent on productivity, innovation, or the quality of services. Um, so I guess I'll say that like inflation is something that exists. It's not a terrible thing unless it's very high or very, very low. So I believe the president said that they, at least when he was campaigning, that he like beat inflation. There's going to be no inflation. That's just not a good thing. We actually don't want 0% inflation. That's not good. We probably want it around like 3%. It's a that healthy spot for us. It's impossible to beat inflation because inflation has all these factors that go into it, and there's no way to just say, we beat it, it's done, you don't have to worry about it anymore. Okay? So who wins, who loses from inflations? So winners are people who owe money with a fixed repayment plan. And then furthermore, it's owners of lands and physical assets. So, for example, if I'm borrowing money from you and you say, pay me back, I'll give you 10 bucks, you have to pay me back $1, plus the 10 bucks a year from now, then an inflation rate is 50%. What I could do is I can take the $10, I can put it into some savings account that's tied to inflation, and so it goes all the way up to 15, and then I can give you your $11 or your $11 back, and I profit $4 from it. So who loses? Well, people who owe money on a variable repayment plan. This is pretty common. So it's tied to the inflation rate. You're not going to win on inflation because businesses have kind of thought about this. Anyone who is owed money, so if I'm the person giving you money, I'm going to lose unless I tie it to inflation. People on fixed incomes are going to lose because, say, they're supposed to make 60K a year for the next 20 years. Right now, it seems pretty good, but in 20 years, that 60K is probably going to be worth like 30K. So that's not your real income would be going down. Holders of financial assets with returns that don't keep up with inflation, such as bonds with a fixed market return rate, like treasury bills. So, treasury bill rates adjust all the time. They usually adjust to inflation. Um, if I get in on a treasury bill and I have to keep my money in there for 2 years, but inflation skyrocketed and I only get 1%, but inflation's 10%, then I am losing. And then people who hold cash. So if I put cash underneath my pillow and I wait or I don't trust banks, so I have it all underneath my bed and I say I have 100K. If I don't put it in a savings account or anything, then I'm going to lose because that 100K is not going to be worth the 100K that it is today. So this is all with inflation. If we flip it to deflation, which, like I said, it doesn't really happen, all these winners and losers get flipped. Okay, let's talk about disinflation, more about deflation. So disinflation is the process of bringing the inflation rate down. So when the inflation rate came down from the highs of 25% to a moderate 2% in the 80s, so 25%, that's unhealthy. That's not good. But we brought it all the way down to 2%, which is that's pretty solid. That's kind of right where we want it. That's called disinflation because we're literally just dropping the inflation rate. Okay, deflation is just decreasing the price level. We can think about this. This is negative inflation. So disinflation happens when inflation starts to slow down. Deflation is when the price level begins to actually decrease. Now, this may be kind of appealing. You're like, this doesn't sound too bad because if I have $1 today, next year it's gonna buy me a lot more than it did today. The problem here is if I have a dollar and I don't want to spend it because next year it's going to be worth so much more money. So what I'm incentivized to do is save a lot. I'm incentivized to put it underneath my bed. I'm going to get my income. I'm not going to use it on anything. And so businesses rely on you using your income to buy their goods. If that's not happening, that's not a good thing for the economy. Okay. So when prices are rising, wages rise along with it because new workers are going to demand these higher wages. This is a rise in costs, which leads to further rises in prices, right? So it kind of works back and forth. When have my pizza kitchen and I sell my pizza for $10, then inflation goes up. So now I'm selling it for $12, but wait, now I have to pay my employees a little bit more. So now I'm going to sell it for $13. It kind of turns into a bit of a spiral. So stopping inflation virtually always results in a recession. It says, is this happening right now? Um, no, I don't think so. I think we're fine with inflation right now. It kind of got under control. We do have these tariffs which are scary. And actually, prices are rising because of that, along with some other things. So maybe, but as of currently when I'm recording this, we are all right. Not great, but all right. All right. We just have one example with inflation. So here it is. It says examples. I lied. It's just one example. So the index number representing the price level changes from 110 to 115 in 1 year. Then from 115 to 120 in the next year. So again, this is kind of like we can think about this as more of like these are CPI measures right here. Okay. Since the index number increases by 5 each year, is 5 the inflation rate each year? And then is the inflation rate the same each year? Okay, so this maybe on the surface, you're like, okay, we go from 110 to 115, 115 to 120 seems to increase by 5 every year. So inflation rate's probably 5% or whatever, and then inflation rate should be the same because they increase by 5. Um, so we have to be careful with this. We are going to use the glorious equation that we'll probably use way too much in this class, which is new minus old over 100. This is for the inflation rate. So I'm going to write inflation, that's I, and I'm going to first say, I'll say I2, meaning the inflation rate from the base year, which is 1 to 115, which I'm calling year 2. So this is 1, this is 2. Okay, and I'm going to do new minus old over old. So 115 minus 110 over 110. I'm going to multiply this by 100. We get it to be this comes out to 4.5% inflation. Okay, so first question is 5 the inflation rate? No, it's actually 4.5%. So it's less than 5. Okay, now let's take it a step further. So again, we're going to do new minus old over old. The CPI for the third year in our experiment is CPI 3. We'll do 120 minus 115, and now we're doing 115 because remember for inflation rate, we're looking at the change for each year, right? So for this case, I'll do 120 minus 115 divided by 115, and then we multiply this by 100. We get 4.3%. Okay. So the inflation rate is not the same each year. We can see the inflation rate actually decreases because again, we're looking at percentage change. And I guess one thing that we did underneath the hood in this question is we're looking at the inflation rate per year, right? So another question I could ask is I could want you to use the same base year. of 110. And if I were to do that, then your old would just be a little bit different, right? So you'd be doing something like this, which would get you a higher percent. Let's see, let's actually do this. So this gets you 10 divided by 110, which gets you 9.1%. Okay, very nice. So this is inflation for the third period using 1 as the base year, which I'll be specific in the question what I want you to do. But typically, we don't look at this. We look at the inflation as in the change in the price level every year. So we would want to do something like these two things. Okay. So again, we're using the percent change here to solve this problem. Today we talked about inflation. That's going to conclude week 3. So you're 2 weeks away from your midterm. Get those reading quizzes in, maybe start on the writing assignment if you feel inspired. Um, and yeah, I will see you all next week where we will start week 4.